In late July 2024, a team of glaciologists and structural engineers descending through the Grindelwald Glacier in the Bernese Oberland encountered a subsurface cavity that had remained sealed beneath the ice for approximately 2 centuries. The discovery emerged not from deliberate archaeological search, but from routine core drilling aimed at measuring thermal conductivity and ice age stratification at depths exceeding 85 meters. Dr. Marcus Hirschman, the project's lead surveyor and glacial physicist, stood at the drill site that morning as the bit punched through the uppermost of 3 distinct ice layers, each representing a different climatic epoch. His preliminary assessment suggested nothing extraordinary: the usual compressed snow, air pockets, and mineral particles suspended within the frozen column. What followed over the next 72 hours transformed a technical drilling operation into something far more consequential. The drill core extracted at depth showed an unexpected anomaly: a sudden absence of ice. Between the secondary and tertiary layers, where continuous ice should have persisted, the sensors registered only void space. This impossibility, a cavity within a glacier that remained uncompressed, undistorted by the weight above it, prompted Hirschman to initiate a second bore at a perpendicular angle. The second core confirmed the first. At precisely 83.4 meters below the surface, the drill had encountered not ice, but air. The temperature readings were remarkable. The void maintained a constant negative 4 degrees Celsius, 14 degrees colder than the surrounding glacier at that depth. This thermal inconsistency alone warranted investigation. Hirschman contacted the Regional Geological Survey in Bern and requested a structural assessment team within 48 hours. When the team arrived on the morning of July 29th, the approach required methodical deliberation. The cavity could not simply be reopened by enlarging the borehole. Such action risked destabilizing the overlying ice, triggering cascade failure through the entire column. Instead, the engineers constructed a reinforced probe scaffold using carbon fiber rods and titanium connectors, lowering a fiber optic camera and atmospheric sampling apparatus through the existing bore shaft. The descent footage revealed darkness at first, then the gradual emergence of something that contradicted all assumptions about what might exist beneath a 200-year-old ice sheet. The cavity was not a natural void in the bedrock. The chamber walls were stone, limestone bedrock, but they bore evidence of deliberate construction. Along the eastern wall, roughly parallel lines had been cut into the rock face, running horizontally at regular intervals of approximately 30 centimeters. These were not natural fractures or erosion patterns. The cuts were too uniform, too methodical. They suggested the presence of scaffolding or support beams, which meant that human hands had been at work here, deep beneath what was now glacier. The camera detected a faint discoloration on the stone, a reddish-brown residue that Hirschman's team later identified as iron oxide, the rust of ancient metal fixtures or tie rods. The atmospheric sample returned from the chamber provided further corroboration. The air itself was archaic. Trace isotope analysis indicated that the sealed pocket had been sealed approximately 204 years prior, placing the closure in the early autumn of 1820. The team detected no volatile organic compounds beyond trace methane and carbon dioxide, no modern contamination, no contemporary bacterial colonies. This was air trapped in time, undisturbed and preserved in perpetuity by the advancing glacier that had sealed the entrance during the Little Ice Age's final phase of expansion. Hirschman made the decision to expand access. Using a precisely targeted controlled burn technique with liquid nitrogen jets, the team carefully widened the borehole to a passage of 40 centimeters in diameter, sufficient for a human body and a minimal camera array. The first physical descent took place on August 2nd, with junior engineer Yannick Berger leading the entry while Hirschman monitored atmospheric composition and stability indicators from the surface. The passage sloped gradually downward, descending through ice in the first 10 meters before entering the stone chamber itself. Temperature increased as Berger descended. At the chamber floor, the readings registered negative 2 degrees Celsius. The interior revealed itself inch by inch as Berger's headlamp swept across the darkness. The chamber was approximately 12 meters in length, 6 meters in width, and 4.5 meters in height. The walls were hewn stone, not naturally occurring caverns. Chisel marks remained visible on the limestone in certain sections, faint but unmistakable. Along the western wall stood what appeared to be remnants of wooden scaffolding, now gray and brittle from centuries of freezing and dehumidification. Several lengths of wood lay on the floor, their structural integrity compromised but their purposefulness intact. In the center of the chamber, partially collapsed and covered in frost, stood what might once have been a wooden framework, possibly a support structure or storage installation. What confronted Berger as he stepped fully into the chamber was a landscape of abandonment preserved in cold. Dust, not modern dust but the dust of more than 2 centuries, undisturbed and undisturbed by the circulation of living air, coated every surface. The cold had suspended time here, halting decay and bacterial colonization entirely. The chamber had become a temporal monument, a sealed capsule from the early 19th century, protected by the advancing ice as the climate shifted and glaciers crept downward across the alpine valleys. But the most striking discovery lay not in the geological evidence or the architectural implications. As Berger's light illuminated the far corner of the chamber, a dark rectangular shape emerged from the frost-laden shadows. It was a wooden chest, approximately 1 meter in length, its lid intact but warped with age. The metal bands that had once held it together remained in place, though severely corroded. The chest was not empty. Even from the entrance passage, Berger could discern the presence of objects within, shadows suggesting paper, perhaps cloth, possibly leather. Whatever lay inside had been sealed within a sealed chamber within a glacier for more than 2 centuries, preserved in an environment so cold and airless that decay had been arrested entirely. The extraction of the wooden chest proceeded with archaeological precision. Dr. Hirschman descended into the chamber himself on August 4th, accompanied by conservator Elizabeth Krohn from the Swiss Federal Institute of Materials Science. The chest remained frozen in place, its wooden base adhered to the limestone floor by centuries of ice and mineral accumulation. Temperature had to be raised gradually, a process requiring 6 hours of gentle radiant heating with controlled humidity introduction to prevent the wood from splintering as moisture rehydrated the fibers. Once freed, the chest was carefully hoisted through the access bore in a protective containment capsule, never exposed to exterior air until it reached the laboratory in Bern. This precaution proved essential. The moment the chest entered an environment of normal temperature and atmospheric pressure, chemical reactions began. Volatile compounds that had remained dormant in the cold emerged from the wood fibers. The smell of preserved pine and iron oxide filled the laboratory air. The lid opened with unexpected ease. Krohn worked with surgical instruments, photographing every layer before removal. Beneath a protective layer of linen cloth lay the contents, documents, dozens of them, bound together with twine and sealed with wax bearing an impressed mark, a circular seal depicting a hammer crossed with a mining pick. The paper had survived almost perfectly. Cold preservation had prevented mold, bacterial decay, and the typical yellowing that accompanied 2 centuries of atmospheric exposure. The documents remained pale. The ink, a carbon-based formula, still legible, but it was the first document that transformed understanding of what lay beneath the glacier. The ledger was written in German, its leather binding tooled with gilt lettering that read, Bergbaugesellschaft Grindelwald, Rechnung und Verzeichnis, 1819-1822. Mining Company of Grindelwald, Accounts and Registry, 1819 to 1822. The handwriting was methodical, the entries dated and annotated with meticulous precision. But these were not typical mining records. The entries documented something far more sinister, a deliberate burial. On the page, dated September 18, 1820, an entry in darker ink, written in a different hand, with visible pressure and agitation, stated the following: Wir Arbeiter verloren, Gasansammlung unerwartbar, Tunneleinsturz teilweise, Leichen geborgen, Versiegelung der Kammer angeordnet durch Direktor Köhler. Niemand spricht, niemand schreibt, niemand hat dieses gesehen. 4 workers lost, gas accumulation unexpected, partial tunnel collapse, bodies recovered, sealing of chamber ordered by Director Köhler. No one speaks, no one writes, no one has seen this. What emerged from the subsequent documents was the anatomy of industrial catastrophe deliberately erased. The mining operation had been illicit, an extraction of particular mineral deposits without permits from the canton authorities. The company had penetrated deeper into the mountain than surveys allowed, employing workers from migrant populations with no legal standing and no families to raise protest. In August 1820, a catastrophic failure occurred. The precise cause remained unclear from the ledger entries, but the sequence was documented. Workers descended, gases, possibly methane, possibly something heavier, accumulated in pockets beneath the surface. The collapse was sudden. 4 men were killed instantly or died within minutes. The company faced a choice: report the incident to authorities, accept liability, lose the mining license and face criminal charges, or bury both the workers and the evidence. They chose burial, but not in a conventional grave. The chamber, a natural cavern in the limestone that the miners had already begun to excavate, was to become a tomb and a repository for the incriminating ledgers themselves. The remaining workers, under threat of non-payment and expulsion without references, sealed the chamber. Wooden scaffolding was installed as support to prevent collapse. The ledgers documenting the operation, the deaths, the company's deliberate concealment, and the names of every worker and administrator involved were placed in the chest and locked within. The entrance to the chamber was then sealed, not hastily, but methodically. Stone was placed, packed earth compressed, and the natural processes of the advancing glacier were relied upon to complete the concealment. Within 2 decades, the Little Ice Age's final expansion did precisely what the company had calculated. The glacier descended, ice accumulated above the chamber, and the sealed portal to the catastrophe vanished beneath hundreds of meters of frozen snow and ancient air. The ledger entry from September 19, 1820, in what appeared to be Director Köhler's own hand, read simply: Versiegelung vollständig. Kammer wird von Eis verschlungen. Das Problem ist gelöst. Für immer. Sealing complete. Chamber will be consumed by ice. The problem is solved. Forever. Hirschman stood in the conservation laboratory, reading the translated text with Elizabeth Crone. The discovery transformed in that moment from geological anomaly to historical crime. This was not a natural void that had captured human artifacts. This was a deliberate archive of concealment, evidence hidden within a hiding place protected by time and climate, a sealed confession waiting 2 centuries for the ice to recede and the truth to emerge. The chest had been constructed with precision for a specific purpose: to preserve testimony that the company had decided could never be spoken. Additional documents confirmed the scope. A second ledger detailed the names of the deceased workers: Joseph Metter, age 32, from Uri Canton; Karl Festinger, age 18, from Valais. 2 others recorded only as migrant laborers, status unregistered. There were wage records showing they had never been officially employed, paid in cash, no documentation, no families notified. There were architectural sketches showing the chamber's dimensions, the placement of support structures, and a notation indicating that the sealing operation required the labor of 16 men working across 4 consecutive days. There was even a draft letter from Director Köhler to the company's board of directors never sent, describing the incident in circumspect language and recommending expedient resolution through environmental containment. It was a term of bureaucratic euphemism for murder, by abandonment and historical erasure. The photographs taken in the laboratory showed every page, every entry, every seal and signature. By August 10, 2024, the archive had been digitized and secured. The bodies themselves, the 4 men from 1820, remained in the sealed chamber beneath the glacier. They had become part of the mountain itself, preserved in ice, awaiting a different decision than the one made by Director Köhler and his company 2 centuries prior. The authentication of the discovered documents occurred in parallel across 3 institutions. Isotope analysis at the Swiss Federal Laboratory dated the paper itself to between 1815 and 1822, consistent with the ledger's claimed time frame. Handwriting experts from the University of Zurich's Institute of Historical Documentation examined the entries against known samples of administrative correspondence from the period. 5 separate signatures appeared throughout the ledgers, and 3 matched authenticated exemplars held in the cantonal archives of Bern. The most critical match was Director Johann Köhler, whose name appeared in official mining permits issued in 1818 and 1819, and whose signature adorned dozens of routine administrative communications. The man existed in the historical record, documented, formal, institutional. Now he was also documented as an architect of concealment. Dr. Hirschman made a deliberate decision regarding public revelation. Rather than announce the discovery through media channels, he contacted the cantonal archives in Bern and requested a formal historical investigation. By August 13, 2024, historians Harold Meyer and Sophie Vulture from the Institute for Alpine History began cross-referencing the ledger entries against every available source from the period. What emerged was a picture of systematic erasure and institutional negligence. The company, registered as Bergbaugesellschaft Grindelwald, had maintained official operations under permit for 5 years, but had maintained a second, clandestine operation in the upper mountain chambers for an additional 3 years. This underground work, unrecorded, unregulated, and staffed by undocumented workers, had generated the profits that sustained the legitimate enterprise. In the cantonal archives, researchers discovered something conspicuous by its absence. The year 1820 contained no accident reports, no casualty notifications, no inquiries into missing workers. For a region where mining incidents were typically documented with meticulous precision, the silence was extraordinary. There were, however, 2 handwritten notes in the margins of administrative ledgers dated October 1820 and January 1821, written in what appeared to be archival notation. The first read, "Gesellschaft inquired regarding worker registry, no record maintained, matter closed." The second noted, "Director Köhler submitted formal notice. All company operations concluded. Permits surrendered voluntarily. No outstanding liabilities." The company had dissolved itself and disappeared from official record within months of the catastrophe. But the 4 names, Josef Maeder, Karl Festinger, and 2 others, opened a different archive. Meyer and Vulture traced family records in the cantonal population registers. Josef Maeder's entry in Altdorf showed that a son, Franz Maeder, was born in March 1821, 7 months after Josef's presumed death. The child's father was listed as Josef Maeder, deceased prior to registration. In the church records of Leukerbad, Karl Festinger's sister filed a formal inquiry in November 1820, asking authorities to investigate his disappearance. The response, documented in a fragmentary letter held in the town archive, stated that no evidence of foul play was discovered and that the boy had likely emigrated to France or Germany, as was common among young laborers of that period. This deflection, in hindsight, appeared designed to discourage further investigation. The 2 remaining names in the ledger, recorded as Johann Stalder, origin unconfirmed, and Wilhelm Kalt, status as above, proved impossible to locate in any contemporary records. This absence itself was significant. They were workers who had been systematically excluded from administrative visibility, even during their lifetimes, making their deaths invisible by design. Hirschman understood the implication. The company had selected migrant workers specifically because they possessed no institutional anchor, no family connections powerful enough to demand answers, no legal standing to file complaints. They were ideal victims because they were already marginal to the society that might have protected them. On August 21st, the decision regarding disclosure became public. Hirschman granted an interview to the Bernese newspaper Der Bund and authorized the release of high-resolution images of the ledgers. The headline read, "2 Jahrhunderte unter Eis, die verborgene Tragödie von Grindelwald. 2 centuries under ice, the hidden tragedy of Grindelwald." The article generated immediate institutional response. The Swiss Federal Office of Culture opened a formal investigation. The canton of Bern appointed a special commission to examine historical mining practices and worker protections. International media outlets picked up the story by August 23rd. Within a week, the discovery had been translated into 6 languages and was being discussed in academic circles as a definitive case study in industrial concealment and historical justice. The most difficult correspondence came from descendants. Franz Maeder's great-great-granddaughter Margot Schmid, age 74, wrote to Hirschman after reading the newspaper account. She explained that her family had carried a story of Josef Maeder's disappearance in the mountains, a narrative that had shifted across generations from tragedy to myth to faint embarrassment. No one had possessed concrete knowledge of what had occurred. Her letter stated, "We always wondered what had happened. My grandmother said he had gone into the mountain and never came back. She said it as though it were inevitable, as though the mountain had simply taken him. Now you tell us the mountain did not take him. Men took him and then hid him in the mountain. This is a different story entirely." Hirschman facilitated a meeting between representatives of the 4 workers' families and the research team on September 5th. The chamber remained sealed beneath the glacier, but the documentation now permitted commemoration and the possibility of proper burial if the families wished to retrieve the remains. The decision, he explained, belonged to them. The 4 bodies could be exhumed carefully, identified through archaeological analysis, and given the dignified interment that had been denied to them in 1820. Or the chamber could be sealed permanently as a memorial site, the men remaining in the place where they had died, but now known, named, and remembered. Margot Schmid spoke first. She said simply, "They should not remain hidden. 200 years of darkness is enough. The exhumation began on September 18, 2024, precisely 104 years after the chamber had been sealed. The decision to retrieve the remains had been made in consultation with the families, the cantonal authorities, and a panel of forensic anthropologists from the University of Lausanne. The technical challenge remained formidable. The chamber existed at depth beneath active glacier, accessible only through the borehole that Hirschman's team had established. To remove 4 bodies preserved for 2 centuries in sub-freezing conditions required creating a pathway that did not destabilize the ice column above or compromise the integrity of the archaeological site. The team constructed an enlarged access tunnel using a combination of thermal drilling and mechanical widening, a process that consumed 18 days and required continuous atmospheric monitoring to detect gas accumulation or thermal collapse risk. On October 6, the first remains emerged from the chamber. The body of Karl Festinger was brought to the surface in a climate-controlled containment pod, still frozen, still perfectly preserved by the cold that had killed him. The skeleton was nearly complete, the clothing remarkably intact, a linen shirt, wool breeches, leather boots worn through at the heels from labor. Embedded in the fabric were trace minerals that matched the limestone composition of the chamber floor. There were no signs of violence on the bones, no fractures suggesting a sudden impact. Death had come from another mechanism entirely. The forensic analysis revealed the cause through trace gas analysis of the chamber air. The bones contained residual carbon monoxide and methane deposits in microscopic quantities, suggesting that the workers had been overcome by toxic gas accumulation rather than crushed by falling rock. They had died standing or kneeling, slowly asphyxiated by an invisible poison, while the company calculated how to make them disappear. 3 more bodies were recovered across the following days. Josef Meder was identified through dental wear patterns and a distinctive femoral fracture that had healed imperfectly during his lifetime, a break that would have caused him chronic pain during his working years. The third body, authenticated through bone chemistry and architectural similarities to known burial practices of the era, was confirmed as Johann Stalder. The fourth remained more difficult to verify. The skeleton showed evidence of advanced age. The worker appeared to have been in his 60s at death, older than any of the other 3. Isotope analysis of bone collagen suggested he had spent his earliest childhood in a Mediterranean climate, possibly North Africa or southern Spain. The name Wilhelm Kelt appeared in the ledger, but no corroborating records existed. This man had been so thoroughly erased from institutional memory that even his true identity remained uncertain. Yet his bones were real, his death unquestionable, his presence in the ledger undeniable. He had existed, he had worked, he had died in darkness, and now he had been found. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Rosa Benedetti, prepared a comprehensive report that was released to the public on October 28. The report documented not only the cause of death, but also the physical condition of the men during their lives. Skeletal stress marks indicated that all 4 had performed sustained heavy labor from early adolescence. Mader showed the characteristic wear of mining work, degenerative joint disease in the shoulders and spine consistent with repetitive overhead exertion. Festinger's bones displayed the pattern of nutritional deficiency typical of poorly fed workers in the 19th century. The bones themselves told stories of hard lives lived at the margins of society, compressed into brief years, and ended in industrial negligence. But they also testified to their own existence. Death had not erased them entirely. The mountain had preserved them, and now science had named them. The institutional response manifested swiftly and with rare consensus. The Federal Parliament of Switzerland passed a formal resolution on November 3, 2024, establishing an official commemoration and acknowledging historical responsibility for labor practices that had permitted such exploitation. The canton of Bern commissioned a memorial to be constructed at the base of the glacier, a stone plinth bearing the 4 names, the date of the catastrophe, and a single inscription, "Forgotten Workers, preserved by stone, remembered by truth." On November 9th, a ceremony was held. Margot Schmid, representative of Josef Meder's family, placed a wreath at the memorial. She stood in silence for 3 minutes while wind moved across the Alpine Valley. When she spoke, her voice carried across the assembled officials and journalists. "My family carried his absence like an inheritance. Now we carry his memory instead. That is a better gift to pass forward." The chamber itself was sealed permanently on November 15th, but not with erasure or concealment. A bronze plaque was installed at the access point, visible only to those who knew to look, describing the historical significance of the site and the names of the 4 men. The remains were transferred to the cemetery of Grindelwald and given individual graves with appropriate markers. Hirschman attended each burial. On the gray afternoon of the final service, standing at the graveside of Wilhelm Kalt, the unnamed man from another continent, he understood something about the nature of concealment and revelation. The company that had sealed this chamber 2 centuries prior had believed that ice and time and bureaucratic silence would preserve their secrets forever. They had been mistaken, not because of great detective work or accident, but because the mountain itself had refused to keep the secret. The advancing glacier, the geological processes that were supposed to bury the evidence, had instead preserved it in perfect condition. The cold that was meant to hide the men had also protected the testimony of their deaths. Dr. Hirschman completed his final report in December 2024. In the conclusion, he wrote, "We do not choose the truths that emerge from the earth. We only choose what we do when they surface. Silence, once broken, cannot be reformed. The men beneath Grindelwald have been silent for 2 centuries. Now that the ice releases them, it falls to us to ensure their silence ends not with their discovery, but with our remembrance. The mountain gave up its secret not because we asked correctly, but because time itself demanded an accounting. We were merely the instruments through which the earth spoke." In the spring of 2025, as the glacier continued its millennial retreat, a small section of stone wall from the original chamber became exposed. The parallel chisel marks that workers had cut 200 years prior were now visible to daylight for the first time since their creation. They were simple marks, crude and repetitive, testifying only to human labor and human skill and human presence in a place where humans should not have had to die. Hirschman stood before that wall on a clear morning in May, wind moving down from the peaks above, and recognized what the marks truly signified. Not tragedy alone, but the refusal of history to remain buried. The mountain, in the end, had chosen to speak.